Thomas the Tank Engine is very proud of his branch line, which he runs up and down with Annie and Clarabel, his two faithful coaches. The Fat Controller had given Annie and Clarabel, as well as his branch line, when he had rescued James from an accident, and became a really useful engine. Annie only takes passengers, while Clarabel carries passengers, luggage and the girl. Annie and Clarabel spend the night at the works, where after a long hard day's work they can get cleaned up ready for tomorrow. Thomas shunts Annie into a siding, while Clarabel turns on the turntable, and Fergus pushes her into the siding opposite. One evening, Thomas spoke to Annie and Clarabel. "Now listen, you two," he said. "Get a good night's rest. We're taking children from Quarreling Station to Knapford, where Bertie will take them on a bus ride around Sodor." And with that, Thomas puffed away to Tidmouth Sheds, and Fergus followed him close behind. Annie tried to go to sleep, but Clarabel wanted to talk. "Oh, isn't Thomas lovely?" she said. "Yes," Annie yawned. "Go to sleep, Clarabel." But Clarabel didn't. She carried on talking. "We are lucky to have such an engine like Thomas, aren't we?" she said. "Yes, we are," said Annie. "Go to sleep, Clarabel," she said again. The coaches remained quiet for a few minutes, until Clarabel blurted out, "Who does Thomas like more, me or you?" "I'm not going to answer that question," said Annie. "Whenever someone asks that question, it always causes arguments between two friends." "I think he likes me more," said Clarabel. "I get to spin on the turntable." Annie wasn't trying to sleep any more. "Really?" she said. "Well, I get to face forward like Thomas. We always have riveting conversations as we're travelling through the countryside of his beautiful branch line. You are just facing backward, looking at the countryside." "Exactly," said Clarabel. "I get to witness all the same sights as Thomas, while you're just stuck facing his back." "That's it," said Annie. "Don't bother talking to me again. I'm going to sleep, so I'm prepared for tomorrow." "So am I," said Clarabel. "I need to get my beauty sleep. You need lots of it by the looks of it. I need to sleep ready for my spin on the turntable," she gloated. Annie was furious, and the two coaches refused to speak to each other for the rest of the evening. They still weren't talking to each other when they woke up the next morning. At last, Thomas and Fergus arrived. "Good morning," said Thomas as he ran to the turntable. "How did you two sleep last night?" "I slept fine," said Annie. "I slept better," said Clarabel. Fergus pulled Clarabel onto the turntable, where she was spun to the right direction, and Thomas coupled Annie and Clarabel together. "Thank you, Fergus," whistled Thomas as he left the works. As Thomas puffed along the line, Annie and Clarabel began arguing again. "He likes me more," said Annie. "No, me," cried Clarabel. Thomas had no idea what his two coaches were arguing about. As they came into the countryside, Annie shouted, "You be quiet while me and Thomas have a nice conversation," she said. "Fine," said Clarabel. "I'll just look at the beautiful countryside." Toby had just passed and was wondering what was going on between the two coaches. At last, Thomas had reached Quarreling Station. The children were all on board and he puffed away, but Annie and Clarabel were still arguing with each other. Thomas had had enough. He stopped sharply and started again several times, bumping the coaches. Thomas had never been forced to bump his coaches before, but he was furious with them for arguing so much. But it had made no difference. Annie and Clarabel began bumping each other too. They bumped and banged so much that eventually the coupling snapped. And before he knew it, Thomas had left Clarabel stranded on the line at the junction. Bertie was waiting at Knapford Station when Thomas puffed in, only with Annie. "Hello, Thomas and Annie," said Bertie. "Where's Clarabel?" Thomas was confused. "She's right behind Annie as usual, isn't she?" he asked. Look again, Thomas," said Bertie. Thomas did, and sure enough he found that only Annie was coupled to him. "Cinders and ashes," cried Thomas. "Where's Clarabel gone?" "And what about the children?" said Bertie. "They're inside Clarabel too, aren't they?" "I knew this would end in disaster," said Thomas, and he puffed away to search for Clarabel, leaving Annie at the station. Toby was just bringing Catherine back to the carriage shed when he saw something. Clarabel was on the main line. Toby rode closer to see her. "Hello, Clarabel," he said. "What are you doing here?" Clarabel told Toby how she and Annie had been arguing all day, and the coupling had snapped and she was left on the main line. "Don't worry," said Toby. "Me and Catherine can take you to find Thomas." "Oh, thank you, Toby," said Clarabel. "Take me to Knapford, that's where Thomas will be." And Toby set off. Meanwhile, Thomas had been searching all over Sodor, and he still hadn't found Clarabel. "Oh no," Thomas thought, "I'll never find Clarabel, and the poor children will be lost forever." Then, when Thomas puffed on the viaduct, he saw something up ahead. Thomas could see Clarabel rolling around the bend. "Hooray, hooray!" cried Thomas, and he steamed off as fast as he could. Toby crossed the suspension bridge over the valley and rounded the bend. Thomas came speeding after him on the other line. Annie was telling Bertie about her and Clarabel's argument when Toby steamed in with Clarabel. Then Thomas puffed in, seconds later. "Oh, Thomas," said Toby, "we were just looking for you. I found Clarabel on the main line. She told me that Annie and her were having an argument and the coupling snapped." "It's my fault," said Thomas. "I must have loosened the coupling." "No," said Annie, "it's my fault. I bumped Clarabel." "No, Thomas, I'm to blame," said Clarabel. "I bumped first." "You don't have to argue about whose fault it is," said Thomas. "Just be glad you're back together." The children boarded Bertie and Bertie set off. And after much to-ing and fro-ing, Thomas and Annie and Clarabel reunited, and he took them out for a run at once. Annie and Clarabel don't argue about who Thomas likes more anymore, because they know that deep down inside, Thomas loves them both equally.